Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptison, and I am here today to be the administrator for this event. And that's good news for me because it means I don't have to do all that much work, just what I'm going to say right here. A little bit later in the event, you might see me back here again, but what we want to do right off the bat is get you to your host and to your guest and to the book that we are going to talk about today. Now, the book is Noah Feldman's The Broken Constitution, Lincoln, Slavery, and the Refounding of America. Comes to us from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, and we thank that publishing house for publishing the book and for assisting us in getting Noah Feldman on the program today. The cost of the book is $30, and you can order it while we are doing this live stream discussion in the links. There will be a link in the comments of this Facebook live stream. Those of you who are watching on Facebook, which is everybody right now, please like and share the event so your friends can see it. If you're watching the event later on our YouTube channel, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can get notices of all the new events and interviews that we do here on A House Divided and through Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. If you have questions for us if you have questions for Noah Feldman during the course of the interview, leave those in the comments. I will curate those questions, and you'll see me come back later in the conversation to present your questions to Noah Feldman. So, without any further ado, let me introduce you to your host for today's event, Daniel Weinberg of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
Thank you, Bjorn. I am Daniel Weinberg here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop studio in Chicago, and hope you can come into town. You'll come by and say hello to us. We are open. And I should say that if you're watching on YouTube afterward, we'll probably still have books available for you, first editions, and they'll be signed by Noah for us on our special book plates that have our logo, which was produced by Carl Sandburg back in the 1930s. And so we'll have signed books through this special book plate if you want to order it while we still have first edition copies here. So we're very happy to have Noah Feldman here. He's the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He's a columnist at the Bloomberg Opinion and host of the podcast Deep Background. He's the author of 10 previous books, including The Three Lives of James Madison, Scorpius, The Battles and Triumphs of FDR's Great Supreme Court Justices, Divided by God, America's Church-State Problem and What We Should Do About It, and Cold War, The Future of Global Competition, and of course, others. The Broken Constitution, Lincoln, Slavery, and the Refounding of America is 368 pages. And I sort of like what is here, but I need to ask you, Noah, the dust jacket, does that imply that Lincoln himself was also broken?
I don't think that I did not intend to imply anything about Lincoln being broken, but I did want to imply that Lincoln did some breaking of his own. Certainly the Constitution was initially broken by the seceding states, but then I argue that Lincoln went on to do some breaking. And it does mean to imply that he was divided in his thinking as he made that process.
Okay, I like that because I saw that break and I said, well, it's not from a glass plate negative that got broken that way.
No, that's the artist's rendition of Lincoln's split thinking as he worked his way gradually through. Yeah.
Also, I'm going to say very quickly, John Meacham and others give praise on the back, and the blurb on the back by Sanford Levinson starts out, is there really a need for yet another book on Abraham Lincoln? I'd like you to tell him for us, next time you speak to him, that yes, there is always room for more books on Lincoln to dissect and interpret the man, because he's still present with us today. Look at newspapers. almost every day you're going to find some newspaper with Lincoln in some way in it. If he joins the Abraham Lincoln Association or the Lincoln Forum, you'll discover that he is still modern and speaking to us. As I sometimes say, there are reasons why there's no Millard Fillmore bookshop. So let's get to the book. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed reading that and the way it was put together, Noah. You begin the book, though, with a quote from Jefferson Davis, who was to us here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, president of nothing. But here is how it started out. This is Jefferson Davis's words in 1850. A moral crevasse has occurred. Fanaticism and ignorance, political rivalry, sectional hate, strife for sectional dominion have accumulated into a mighty flood and pour their turgid waters through the broken Constitution. Was he using broken Constitution in the same way as you do?
Not entirely. I wanted to start with that quote from Jefferson Davis, whom, as you say, is kind of the anti-Lincoln, because it captures something of the controversy about the Constitution in the years before the Civil War. And that's an aspect of our thinking about the Constitution in the Civil War and about Lincoln that we don't always think about. In that quote, you're seeing Jefferson Davis, not yet the president of the Confederacy, but part of a group of Southern elites who are starting to think slowly about secession, arguing that the constitutional settlement, as they know it, not the text of the Constitution, but the settlement of the Constitution, which had been reaffirmed in the Missouri Compromise and in the compromise over the tariffs of 1828, that structure of compromise was no longer doing what it had set out to do, and that from their perspective, it was broken. And in that historical moment, Lincoln was on the other side. Lincoln was saying the Constitution isn't broken. The Constitution is fine. The Constitution still preserves the compromise that it preserved from the beginning. And I think that brings home the kind of remarkable fact that although the initial breaking of the Constitution then came from the Confederacy, Lincoln himself had, I argue, had to break the Constitution as even he himself understood it in order to preserve the Union.
I want to start off by asking you, I'm glad to have a constitutional lawyer here to help us in some of these things. The Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, what is their relationship? Does the Constitution flow from the Declaration being its instrument? And is that how Lincoln viewed it?
Let me start by answering that question as a legal matter, and then I'll try to answer it as a historical matter, and then I'll close with Lincoln. As a legal matter, nothing in the Constitution depends on or refers back to the Declaration. The Declaration was an explanation offered by the American founders to the world of why they were breaking the bonds of obligation that until that moment they had all professed to the British Crown and the British government. But it didn't create by itself an acting federal government. It didn't lay out a blueprint for it. And the individual states that after the Declaration of Independence created constitutions, created their own individual constitutions. The Articles of Confederation, which brought them together into an organized entity, also didn't refer directly to the Declaration. And so when the framers sat down to write the Constitution, they could have referred back to the Declaration, but they didn't. And that is an important fact. It means that the Declaration is in some sense not a formal legal document. It declared something that was already, according to them, in existence, their right to be independent. The Constitution is a legal document. It sets down rules and responsibilities, and it was ratified, whereas the Declaration wasn't ratified by anybody. It was announced and signed by some people, and then it set into motion the revolution that followed. Now, in terms of a historical answer, there it's a bit more complicated. If you had asked the people who drafted the Constitution, what do you think of the Declaration? They probably all would have said, we accept its basic principles. They might have already differed a little bit on its interpretation, but they would have accepted its basic principles. But they didn't necessarily think that the Constitution fully embodied those principles. And let me give you a concrete example. The concrete example is the statement in the Declaration, the famous statement that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that those include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Constitution never says that American citizens are equal, and it doesn't guarantee any form of equality. The Constitution does say in the Due Process Clause that the federal government can't violate your individual rights to life, liberty, and property, not happiness, but property. And so that refers back to the troika of basic rights that Americans believed in. But it's not quite the same thing as institutionalizing exactly the principles of the Declaration. Last of all, Lincoln. Lincoln thought that the Declaration expressed moral ideas about what our country should be. But he thought that what we were bound by law to observe was the Constitution. And so in, for example, his address to the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois in 1838, where he talks about what the United States is as a country committed to the rule of law, it's the Constitution he's talking about. And that constitutional principle included, he believed, the protection of slavery. Rhetorically, as Lincoln became less and less enamored of the Constitution as it was being interpreted by the Supreme Court, he started talking more and more about the Declaration. But he believed, up through his first inaugural at least, and probably for some months thereafter, that he was bound to obey the Constitution, even with reference to slavery.
I'm going to ask you quickly also about, I don't know if I should ask this or not. I don't want to take a lot of time on this.
I'll give a short answer.
Can we think about Magna Carta and the Constitution? Are there any similarities there? Neither of them did what we today think of Magna Carta and the Constitution for all people. It was for a smaller number of people. So is there a similarity there in the Magna Carta and our Constitution?
Magna Carta matters most for what later Englishmen made of it.
Yeah.
So in 1687-88, during the so-called Glorious Revolution, when Englishmen were reframing and restating their conception of what their rights were and producing what was called their Bill of Rights, they referred back to Magna Carta. And they treated Magna Carta as the source of the basic right to the due process of law. And in that sense, they made Magna Carta, a bit retrospectively, into the symbol of their fundamental constitutional commitment. In that sense, our Constitution is a bit similar in that it includes the principle of due process, and in that Americans do tend to refer back to our Constitution when we're stating our basic rights and principles. It's also true that the principles of Magna Carta weren't enough and had to evolve, and the principles of our original Constitution of 1787 also weren't enough and also had to evolve.
So you talk about Lincoln being a profound constitutional thinker. I'm not sure we have always viewed him that way in that sense, but everyone views through our own prism, and I'm glad you are viewing it through your prism that way. I'm glad he wasn't a pudding manufacturer, but tell us how he was a profound constitutional thinker. Just expand on it a little briefly for us.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, Daniel, because this is really one of the big claims of my book and one that I hope will be of interest to those who are watching. You're right that we don't think of Lincoln's real fundamental contributions to American constitutional law, and we really should. So I would describe two different contributions, each of which are fundamental. The first is that Lincoln is our leading theorist of the Constitution in crisis. And that's because, responding to the crisis of secession, he took step after step after step that depended on a theory of necessity, depended on the theory that as commander-in-chief, sworn, as he said, an oath registered in heaven to protect the Constitution, he had to do what was necessary to preserve the Union, and that included fighting and then winning a war. And in that process, Lincoln developed the idea that the commander-in-chief has the right to do that which is necessary to win the war. And that remains a cornerstone of contemporary thinking about the president's war powers, especially under crisis. And so in that sense alone, Lincoln made a fundamental contribution. The other contribution is even less obvious, but I think is equally important. And this has to do with what Lincoln was thinking right when he became president in deciding whether to go to war unilaterally without waiting for Congress to coerce the Southern states back into the Union. Now, that sounds obvious to us today. We say, well, of course Lincoln went to war. After all, the South had seceded. But James Buchanan, in his presidency, had gotten an opinion from his Attorney General, Jeremiah Black, a formal written opinion of great length that Buchanan adopted and used in his last State of the Union address, that said that the US government did not have the constitutional authority to coerce seceding states to re-enter the Union. The states were engaged in revolution, Buchanan said, but if they did that revolution, the Constitution didn't empower the government, the federal government, to force them back in because of the principle of consent of the governed. Lincoln set out to develop a real theory about why that was wrong. And the core of Lincoln's theory altered and changed the original theory of consent of the governed on which the Constitution had originally been based, which was based on the philosophy of the English thinker John Locke. That idea said, and this is expressed in the Declaration of Independence, groups of people can choose to enter a government, and those same groups of people, by implication, can choose to leave the government. And Lincoln said, but wait a minute, if that's true, then anyone who's a minority in this majoritarian government can get concessions from the majority by threatening to leave. And if the government can't make them stay, he said, what kind of authority, what kind of incentives, what kind of leverage does the government have against people who demand concessions and say that if they don't get the concessions they want, they'll go? So from this, Lincoln concluded that the majority must have the constitutional authority to coerce the minority, including by military force, to participate in the Union. And I do not think the framers, and I've written about James Madison, would have agreed with that formulation at all, because it violates the principle of consent. What Lincoln was doing is he was referring not to Locke, but indirectly to the ideas of Thomas Hobbes, who basically did not have the view that people freely get together to form a government. He had the view that first the government comes into existence, and then we can morally justify the coercion that the government uses through a theory that people would consent if you gave them a rational choice, which you shouldn't do. And so that is a fundamental transformation in our constitutional theory. And I think it is now our coherent view. I don't think most Americans today think that if a bunch of states seceded, that the federal government would be right to let them go. I think most people would think that the federal government would be right if it chose to coerce those states to remain.
Now, Lincoln, in accepting what you call the compromise constitution, and I'm sure others do that as well, and he felt, of course, he couldn't change anything because that would be dictatorship. But I'm looking through the prism of Lincoln's red line, and that is the nationalization of slavery. There will be no nationalization of slavery. And Lincoln kept that red line even after he was president-elect, and even his own party was saying, hey, maybe we should back off this because there's going to be secession. There might be war. And, he was not naive. He must have known that there'd be consequences for his holding onto that red line of no slavery into the territories. And so he wanted that, he looked and liked that balance of power that was there in the compromises beforehand. That's what everyone was doing. But he knew, he had to have known that new states carved out of the territories, if he stopped slavery from entering there, were going to come in as free and tip that balance. So my thought is his radicalism beginning much before his presidency, and because of what I'm saying?
It's a great question, and I think not, and here's why. Lincoln's answer to those who said we should limit or restrict slavery was a two-part answer. First, he said the Constitution absolutely protects individual states' enslavement of people. And he said that in his first inaugural address, when he said, I have no intention to do anything about slavery in the states, nor do I have the constitutional power to do so. When it came to the territories, Lincoln disagreed with the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case, which there were two parts of the Dred Scott case, but the one that's relevant to our conversation here is the part where the Supreme Court said that Congress lacked the power to prohibit slavery in the territories. Now, that was the law of the land. And Lincoln bent over backwards to explain how it was that he could disagree with the Supreme Court's opinion without directly denying the authority of the Supreme Court to have the last word on the meaning of the Constitution. And especially in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas pushed him very hard on this because he saw that Lincoln was vulnerable. Because if Lincoln said the Supreme Court was wrong, then that was possibly an implication that the government should ignore the Supreme Court. And
Was
Lincoln
he putting up some sort of a wall, though the legal versus the political, and the political will hold sway in the future?
Lincoln never said that precisely, because that would have amounted to saying that Congress could go beyond what the Supreme Court did. So instead, especially in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, is he was ambiguous. And what he basically said was, the Supreme Court has overturned decisions before. We think this one should be overturned. Something's not really a precedent in front of the Supreme Court until it's been around for a while, and this hasn't been around for very long. So he fell short of literally and explicitly saying, I would ignore the Supreme Court if I were president, and I think Congress should ignore the Supreme Court. But on the other hand, he did acknowledge that the Supreme Court had spoken and that he didn't agree with the outcome of that decision. So I do not think that was fundamental radicalism. Now, the key part of your question, which is true though, is that the Southern states did view his election as an excuse or a reason to secede. And that was because they feared that in practice, they might not be able to continuously extend slavery. And they knew that Lincoln had been a sharp critic of Dred Scott. And so they were worried about the possibility that eventually they would no longer have the constitutional capacity to sustain slavery. But Lincoln himself bent over backwards to say that the Constitution protected slavery in those states.
Well, you're right that you say Lincoln chose war. And my question is there a difference between choosing war and letting war come? I've not seen him as a war president, that he was out to do that. He's, as you say, bending over backwards. And even in his mind, he was saying, well, this won't work and we'll get into war. He knew that may come, but he was willing, the first president, willing to let war come. So was he saying that it's a natural outgrowth of what he was doing as well?
Here's how I would put it. If you think about the situation that Lincoln faced when he took office in early March of 1861, the crisis couldn't be avoided because 7 states had already seceded and more were threatening to secede. At that point, no shots had yet been fired. Lincoln had the option of saying to the Southern states, and this was actually the recommendation that his most important general gave him at the outset of the war, wayward sisters, go in peace. Go ahead. We will not stop you from going. That was after all what Buchanan had said was his constitutional duty to say. And what's more, there was no obvious way for Lincoln to win the war at that point. The regular US Army, this is probably the single statistic that most shocked me in the research for this book. The regular US Army, when Lincoln took office, had fewer than 25,000 soldiers in it. And Lincoln had an estimate from Winfield Scott, that same general, that it would take at least 35,000 troops just to defend Washington, D.C. against an onslaught if it were to come from the Confederacy. And that was actually probably a low estimate when you figured that in the War of 1812, some 30,000 hastily gathered militia desperately failed, to defend Washington, D.C. at the so-called Battle of Bladensburg, which is barely a battle because basically the militia turned tail and ran in the face of a much smaller but well-trained British force. So Lincoln didn't have a simple way to win the war. He would have to raise troops. They would have to come from militia. He'd have to increase the military. And then if he won the war, Winfield Scott also told him, he would then have to coerce the Southern states to remain in the Union and remain in a position of military occupation. So given all of that, Winfield Scott actually recommended to him as a military and political matter that he should potentially just let the South go. And Lincoln could have done that, and he chose not to do that. And in that sense, he chose war. Even after Fort Sumter was fired on, he didn't have to raise that military and attempt to coerce the Southern states to remain in. And ultimately, that was Lincoln's most fateful historical decision, his most important decision, because the other ones, both the suspension of habeas corpus and of free speech, which I talk about in the book, and of emancipation, they followed from that initial decision to choose war. So in my view, even when Lincoln himself said, "and the war came," that's a passive voice formulation that doesn't exactly give him the responsibility and indeed the credit, I think, that he deserves for choosing the war.
Well, I go back at this point to a letter he wrote to Judge George Robertson in Lexington, Kentucky in August of 1855. And there's an area in here that he says, now this is the only time he said that, and I've been pushed on this, that it's the only time, but as a son of a psychoanalyst, I think one can say something once to your analyst or to a private letter and then not say it again, but that's actually what one is thinking. He said, in part, "You are not a friend of slavery in the abstract. In that speech, you spoke of the peaceful extinction of slavery and used other expressions indicating your belief that the thing was at some time to have an end. Since then, we have 36 years of experience, and this experience has demonstrated, I think, that there is no peaceful extinction of slavery in prospect for us. The signal failure of Henry Clay and other good men in 49, and he goes on that regard, but he feels that right then, he thinks that only war will take out slavery." So was that a part of his unconscious or maybe even conscious feeling when he chose war, as you say?
That's a great question. And I like the question of whether a single utterance can be revealing. When you're in the analyst's chair and you're free associating, good things can come out that can be potentially very valuable. When you're a politician with substantial regional and national aspirations, which Lincoln was by 1855, and you're writing letters to people who are not your most intimate friends, you know that those are public documents. And so I think, I do this in the book. I read Lincoln's letters to his friends that were meant for publication and to his colleagues very carefully to see what his objectives were in each individual context. I think what Lincoln said there can be parsed pretty carefully. He's saying there's no route to a peaceful extinction of slavery. Now, until then, he, following Henry Clay, whom you mentioned, and the American Colonization Society, hoped, believed, I would say fantasized, to continue the psychoanalytic theme, that slavery would peacefully eliminate itself, either through compensated emancipation by slaveholders or through the mechanism of Northerners buying the freedom of enslaved people, who would then be allowed to, or encouraged, perhaps even required, to leave the United States and go and colonize either sites in Africa or in Central America. And perhaps what Lincoln is conceding in that letter is that that does not seem to be working, notwithstanding the objective and plan for it to work for a long time. That said, even after the Emancipation Proclamation was announced, Lincoln continued to work for compensated emancipation in the northern states, in the states that were still in the Union, which of course the Emancipation Proclamation didn't reach. So his desire or his fantasy for the problem of slavery to go away without a war didn't end even once the war began. He still wanted to find mechanisms to do so. But I do think you're right that at some point, Lincoln came to realize that only war would eliminate slavery. But that doesn't mean he favored war. If you take seriously both what he said in that letter and what he said in the first inaugural address, and I think they're compatible, he's saying in the first inaugural address, there's always going to be slavery. It's always going to be protected by the Constitution. That's okay. I'd rather have that than a war. In the first inaugural, he's offering the Confederacy a deal. Come home, and I will guarantee the protection of slavery forever. Again, consistent with his letter.
Well, before we get to this, Bjorn, I just want to kind of finish this area up for a moment, because Lincoln was a 19th century white man. And, but I think his actions speak louder than his possible unknown racist thoughts. as a 19th century white man. But so it leads me to think the most remarkable thing about Lincoln, frankly, is his continuing transformation. We know of it in the 1850s and the growth, but it also occurred throughout his presidency. He was open to learning. Herndon said of him, his law partner, his third law partner, that he thought more than any other man he knew. And I think that was where his growth came. He was able to grow and transform himself, and therefore transform us.
I'm in entire agreement with that. I think it's more impressive that Lincoln found it in himself to emancipate enslaved people in the Confederacy. It's more impressive that he did that, given that he himself, just a few months into the war, said that doing so, in his letter to Orville Browning, said that doing so would be an act of dictatorship. It's more impressive that he made that progress in the course of a year. That letter is signed September 22nd, 1861, a year to the day before Lincoln announced a draft of what would become the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's a year of extraordinary progress and individual determination. And I also think that we don't need to spend a lot of time worrying about exactly what, I mean, it's interesting, but whether Lincoln's views were somehow ahead of his time. You know, even his contemporaries saw him as a person of his times, and they sometimes criticized him and they sometimes praised him. So Frederick Douglass criticized Lincoln viciously many times, including after Lincoln, having announced the draft Emancipation Proclamation, called in a delegation of senior African-American leaders in Washington, D.C., and told them that the war was their fault. You know, told them the war was Black people's fault. And Douglass was outraged by this, as are we when we read that.
Yeah.
But Lincoln was doing politics, and after emancipation happened, Douglass defended Lincoln. And so, you know, there you have, you know, one of his most brilliant, thoughtful contemporaries making, I think, a fair assessment of Lincoln's capacities and character. So to me, I came out of the research for this book and the writing of this book much more impressed by Lincoln, precisely because of the transformation that he underwent.
Yeah, that's how I feel, and many others as well. And just as a coda, he wrote a letter in 1864 to newspaper editor Charles Robinson, which you refer to in the book. And there was another transformation of Lincoln from 1862 in his letter to Horace Greeley. So once again,
Absolutely. At one point, he's saying to Greeley, I would save the Union, and I don't care what that means for enslaved people. You know, I would free the slaves, I would allow the slaves not to be free, I'll do whatever it takes to preserve the Union. But a year and a half later, he's saying, no, there's no going back on the question of slavery, because by then he had taken a decisive moral step to transform, and in my view, break the constitutional compromise of 1787. And, you know, just the key takeaway here is that's why we don't have the Constitution of Madison. What we have is the Constitution of Lincoln, the Constitution that broke the slavery compromise and then heralded in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
Bjorn, you must have some people watching who have some interest or questions.
Oh yes, indeed. We have a lot of people watching today. It's a popular live stream. Our regulars are out there, and I'm going to say hello to them. First, though, I have something to add. Another response to Sanford Levinson's blurb from 1936. I think we've all seen it. James G. Randall writing, "Has the Lincoln theme been exhausted?"
That was almost a century ago.
Yeah, asking that in the American Historical Review in January of 1936. So Sanford Levinson, it's a good question, but the answer is always the same, no. And well, that's great. That keeps us in business. Hey, let's get some shout outs to our customers and our friends who have been watching. Like I said, we have some of our regulars here, and I especially want to say hello to Dave Bradley, who is watching from cold and rainy Weldon in the UK. So I don't know if he's going to comment on our previous Magna Carta part of the discussion. Perhaps Dave can throw in something on that. And then Dave Wiegers is watching from here in Illinois, from Gurney. Brian Steenbergen is watching from Michigan. And I am going to share a question that Brian Steenbergen asked, and it would be, would it be accurate to say that Lincoln inherited a broken Constitution and not that Lincoln himself broke the Constitution?
I think both are true, but I would tend to emphasize the latter formulation. So Lincoln inherited a constitution that was broken in two senses. One, in the sense that the underlying compromise of 1787 that had been renewed over the course of the first part of the 19th century wasn't holding. And that's why the second part of the meaning of the Constitution was already broken. The 7 southern states had already seceded. So in that sense, there's no question that the Constitution was broken, that Lincoln walked into a circumstance where the seceding states had broken the Constitution. They had engaged in an act of unconstitutional or extra-constitutional revolution. Mm-hmm. But it's also true that at that moment, Lincoln had options, and the options that he chose put him in a position of taking actions that I think even by his own lights were extra-constitutional or unconstitutional. We've already spoken about the most significant one, that is emancipation, which Lincoln himself deemed in the summer of 1861 to be an act of dictatorship. And he said that when John C. Fremont, the 1856 presidential candidate, whom Lincoln had made a general, actively emancipated enslaved people who belonged to people whom Fremont deemed to be disloyal to the Union and loyal to the Confederacy. Lincoln ordered him to reverse his actions, and when he refused, Lincoln fired him and reversed those actions himself, and explained in a letter to his friend that this was simply an act of dictatorship. And Lincoln then subsequently did exactly that himself, having in the meantime convinced himself that his powers as commander-in-chief, needing to win the war, entitled him to do this. And there was I spent a long time about this on the book. In the book, there was a long and well-developed constitutional legal theory of international law, according to which that was beyond the powers of the government to do. The other instance, which we haven't really spoken about yet, was the suspension of habeas corpus. There, too, Lincoln suspended habeas unilaterally without Congress. He asked Congress to ratify the decision. They said no. And, the suspension of habeas is contemplated in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 9, which is part of the Constitution that talks about Congress's powers. And as the Chief Justice of the United States explained at the time, Lincoln was acting beyond his constitutional authority. And as the Supreme Court of the United States held after the war as well, by establishing martial law in the parts of the United States that were not war zones, but were part of the Union, which is exactly what the suspension of habeas corpus effectively did, Lincoln also violated the Constitution. And that remains the judgment of constitutional law, official normative Supreme Court constitutional law to this day. So I do think of that as an instance of breaking the Constitution. Lincoln tried to justify it essentially by saying it's necessary, and it never says explicitly that it has to be Congress. But I think those were fallback viewpoints to justify what he felt he had to do. And there were consequences. There were major consequences for the suspension of free speech in the United States. Somewhere between 15 and 40,000 Americans were arrested and held without criminal charge for extended periods of time. And many of them were not Confederate sympathizers, but just folks who thought the war was a bad idea.
All right. Hey, if anybody else has any more questions that they want to ask, you can add those questions in the comments. I will probably jump in a few more minutes when we're closer to the end of our time. But for now, I'm going to send it back to Dan Weinberg if you have any follow-ups to Brian's question.
I do. What I want to follow up with, a couple of things. One is that, of course, Lincoln was justifying suspending habeas corpus in numbers of cases. Should I keep that rule and let the rest of the Constitution fall apart? What do you think as a constitutional lawyer of that argument?
Yes, the famous all the laws but one argument,
Exactly.
where Lincoln says, well, in the Southern Confederate seceding states, none of the federal laws are being enforced. So therefore, I'm justified in suspending this one little law. And he goes further. He criticizes habeas by saying, habeas is really mostly used to let guilty people go free on a procedural technicality. In the book, I talk about this argument at some length, and I'm not very impressed by it. And I'll tell you why. Habeas corpus isn't just one little law or just one little right. So for listeners who aren't up on their constitutional law, habeas corpus is the right that says that if the government arrests you, detains you for any reason, it has to bring you to court, usually within 24 hours, charge you with a crime that is a crime under the written laws of the United States of America, put you to trial in front of a jury of your peers, and if you're acquitted, you get to go home. If you're convicted, you get punished. So without that right, the government can grab you up wherever you are at any moment and hold you as long as it wants with no review from any independent decision maker for any reason. And so that's why habeas is sometimes called the right to have rights. It's also the right that is the most fundamental principle of the rule of law. So if you suspend habeas corpus, you're not just suspending one little law, you're suspending any law you want to suspend, including every right in the Constitution. And indeed, the main thing that Lincoln used the suspension of habeas to do was to shut down newspapers, arrest editors and journalists, and then eventually, more broadly, people whose political views he didn't like because he deemed them to be undermining to the war effort and undercutting of the draft, which every military needs to win. And by Lincoln's chain of reasoning, if someone said the war was a bad idea, that sent the message to ordinary people that they should tell their children that they should resist the draft. And if they resisted the draft, they might not win, the North might not win the war. Or he said people might become draft dodgers, or they might even desert on the battlefield, and then that person would have to be executed. And so he said it's just as bad to say the war is wrong as it is to desert on the battlefield. That's a pretty extreme chain of reasoning, and we would not recognize it in any other context. So, the country was in jeopardy, there's no question, but I don't think that that argument was justified with respect, again, to the North. We're talking about suspension of habeas corpus in the North. We're not talking about in the war zones where military law, of course, appropriately applied.
Well, without supporting what Lincoln was doing, because any Democrat, small d Democrat, has to be upset about that suspension and precedent that it might give in the future. We certainly were lucky to have a dictator that was Lincoln and not someone else, perhaps. But this was, talking about context, it was a civil war. It was right there. Kansas, they were killing your neighbor. You could wake up dead in the morning from your next door neighbor. So maybe civil war is a little different. I don't know how effective it was. That would be an interesting discussion. How effective was habeas corpus in helping the war effort? Certainly war with another country, one could be a little more lenient, but civil war? So that's where I wonder, is it almost a foregone conclusion, civil war, these things are going to happen, Constitution be damned?
Well, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, because it's important to note that Lincoln didn't suspend every right that Americans had.
No, they still had elections.
They had elections, and he thought he was going to lose the election of 1864.
And as a dictator, he was ready to lose an election.
Yeah, so when I say that Lincoln exercised dictatorial powers, it's really important to be clear, first of all, that I'm using his own terminology. This is not, my terminology that I'm projecting backwards onto him. These are his own words. But second of all, the word dictatorship conjures up in our mind the idea of someone who abolishes electoral democracy altogether, someone who, if I may say so, I'm trying to stick with the 19th century, but someone who, say, attempted to overturn the legitimate results of a democratic election in order to stay in office. That would be a kind of dictatorship that we're more familiar with from the 20th century. That's not what Lincoln did. What he did was exercise powers that were not conferred on him by the Constitution and justify that on a theory of necessity. And once he was doing that, he was effectively the decider, to use the term that George W. Bush sometimes used, but that goes also back to the German constitutional theorist Carl Schmitt. He was the decider on what exceptions should be allowed and what exceptions shouldn't be allowed. And the proof that he was the decider is that he asked Congress for validation, but when Congress refused to give it to him, he didn't stop. And when the Chief Justice of the United States issued an opinion saying you violated the Constitution, Lincoln ignored him. So in that sense, the other branches of government did what they could to attempt to constrain Lincoln in that realm. And he continued to do what he wanted to do, what he thought was appropriate. So is it inevitable? Whenever you look at historical events, you can always say, oh, it was going to have to happen that way. And in some sense, that's true, because that is how they happened. But I think that Lincoln could have taken a different approach to the free press rights of people who were critical of his administration and still won the war. I don't think
would you have done?
that Lincoln won the war was because of the suspension of habeas corpus.
What would you have done?
Briefly,
elevator.
If I were in his position, if I had been in Lincoln's position, I might have been inclined to embrace military rule in Maryland in the spring, summer, and fall of 1861, when militias sympathetic to the Confederacy were burning bridges and rioting crowds were interfering with the passage of troops. I might have had the same instinct that Lincoln would have had. But I think that once that was managed, which it really was by the winter of the late fall, early winter of 1861, I think I would have backed away from that model. I would try to see Madison as my model. The War of 1812 wasn't a civil war, but there was a point in the War of 1812 when the northern states were actually getting together for a big convention that they held in Hartford, Connecticut, where some people were saying that they should secede from the Union and make a separate peace with Britain. And Madison did nothing about it. He allowed it to happen. He took the view that his job was to protect the Constitution, and if he had to subvert the constitutional right to free speech in order to preserve it, that was pointless. So I think I would be a little more like Madison than like Lincoln. That said, it's important to acknowledge, Madison was not a successful wartime president. The United States almost lost the War of 1812, which we began, barely fought it to a draw. And Lincoln was a successful wartime president. After a lot of dithering around and trouble, the North did ultimately win the war. And so, there's a huge literature about whether Lincoln did a good job on the military side or not, but one can say definitively that Madison did a poor job in the War of 1812. So, I would be more Madisonian, but then again, Lincoln won the war and Madison didn't.
We're jumping around in this book, or at least I am. And it's a fascinating book. I really recommend to any Lincoln obsessive, as we are here, because it brings out so many different aspects of Lincoln that maybe we give him a pass on or don't think about as much. And it's broken down, by the way, chapters are broken down into fairly easily digestible areas to think and talk about. So I think it's, even though we have a constitutional lawyer writing it, I think it's fairly easily accessible for all of us out here. So jumping around though, you have an interesting little discussion on his Cooper Union speech, and you say it had strange content. Explain that, please.
Sure. First of all, thank you for being nice about the book. I hope it is readable. And I do believe, I do this in all my books. I learned this when I was writing my book on the Supreme Court justices in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. My best friend read a draft and he said, the way I read a book, he's a lawyer. He said and he loves history, but he said, the way I read a book is I pick up the book, I read for a half an hour, 45 minutes, and then I go back to my children and my life and my job. So he said, wouldn't it be nice if the book were broken up into sections that you could read in that period of time? And that's exactly what I've done here. The sections, none of them would take more than a half an hour or 40 minutes to read.
Right.
And I really tried to write it for the general reader. I do that in my Bloomberg column, and I'm glad that you think I was able to do that. What I say about the Cooper Union speech is it's one of those speeches that everyone has heard of and almost nobody ever reads. And that's because it doesn't have a lot of uplifting rhetoric. And the first half of it is devoted to a very detailed, dry, almost arcane set of arguments, according to which Lincoln is trying to claim that as many of the framers as he can come up with, as many of those who were at the Constitutional Convention as he can come up with, believed that Congress had the power to limit slavery in the territories. And to do this, he adds them up, making very tendentious claims about how you can reach this conclusion, and concludes that a bare majority, in fact, supported this view. So this is an attempt to use history, very dry history, to refute the Supreme Court's Dred Scott opinion. And so when you read it, you think to yourself, how did this speech turn Abraham Lincoln from a promising Illinois politician who had nonetheless managed not to get elected to the Senate into a credible presidential candidate, a leading presidential candidate? And I think the answer lies in the way that Lincoln was trying to actually re-articulate a compromise vision and change the sense of who was at fault for the way things were developing. The Southern states were saying to the Northern states, you've broken our compromise, it's your fault. Lincoln was saying to the Southern states, and he says this explicitly in the second half of the speech, no, we're not offering to change anything. We're not radicals. We're not changing anything. And we're not even threatening slavery. We're just saying slavery shouldn't be extended into the territories. So if there's any radicalism here, it's you. You guys are the radicals. And so I think that appealed to Northerners who wanted a vision of compromise that would enable them to recognize that the South might secede, but if they did, they would be able to say, it's not on us, it's on you. And I think that's what's happening in that speech.
Well, that and his looks, at least through Brady's photograph, Lincoln said, helped make him president. I'm going to go further back just because you devoted, if you take away the index and the footnotes, and just stick to the narrative, 0.25%, about 8 pages to the Blackhawk War, which I have a large collection of at home. So I was very happy to see the Blackhawk War in there. And if I had time, I'd tell you a couple of things that happened. For instance, when you talk about Jackson bringing Blackhawk out to show him respect, I think it's more to show him the power of the white civilization. And actually, Blackhawk was a magnet to people. They really wanted to see him. When Jackson and Blackhawk were each, after they met in Washington, were each going up the East Coast. Jackson was on a political tour, and they were sending Blackhawk up the East Coast as well on a parallel tour. Blackhawk was outdrawing Jackson, and Jackson said, get him back out west. So he was abruptly sent out west. Why the Blackhawk War, 8 pages in this book?
Well, if you like the Blackhawk War, Daniel, you would have liked my rough draft where I had about 25 pages on the Blackhawk War. And this was after a battle with my spectacular editor, Alex Starr. Here's why I think that the Blackhawk War is really interesting and extremely important. Even though in Lincoln's political development, it played a relatively small role, I do think it was the moment when Lincoln first saw himself as a potential politician. The very first office he ever ran for was the spontaneous run to be captain of his company, of his militia company, and he won. And that was a measure of prestige and esteem. And he also showed some genuine bravery, not so much on the battlefield, because he didn't see the battlefield particularly while anyone was fighting on it, but in re-volunteering to continue in the militia, even after a significant number of militiamen had actually been killed in an ambush, which they had essentially walked into because of the incompetence of their elected officers who didn't know anything about military tactics. Lots of people quit at that point. Lincoln didn't. And even though Lincoln liked to make light of that later and say, well, I had no job, the truth is it did take some genuine bravery. But the real reason I wanted to write about it is I think it provides really interesting context for the war as it eventually came, and for the way that the United States was still in the process of expanding in the early part of Lincoln's life, and therefore for the shift in perspectives on slavery that Lincoln and others underwent. Because in the period when the United States was still expanding, that expansion entailed not only the extension of slavery, but the displacement through expropriation and, where necessary, by war and by killing of Native American people. And although a lot of that had already happened by the time Lincoln was a young man, the Blackhawk War is an example of the elimination of the last military resistance in the Old Northwest by Native Americans. And that shows you that that expansionary process, it required the whole country to participate. It required US soldiers, that is federal troops, as well as state militias. And it was a cooperative undertaking. And that cooperative undertaking of expansion was one reason that the Union had to hold together. And it's one reason that free states continued to renew their compromise with slave states. Everyone wanted to compromise. It also shows you, last of all, that when the US Army finally motivated itself, when the US government raised troops, it would defeat anyone who stood in its way. It defeated Native Americans, it defeated Mexico in the Mexican-American War, and ultimately, it's the real reason that the Union was able to prevail in the Civil War. It was the greater population and the greater industrialization that led to the military might that enabled the United States to win the war and to defeat the Confederacy.
Of course, the Sac and Fox Indians were pretty settled. They had one of the largest village, Indian village in the country. And they were pretty settled. Still, they were in miners' way, those who wanted to mine their area. So even they were pushed out. We're not going to have time here to get into some of the things I wanted to, but they're in the book. And I wanted to tell our viewers this, that I was going to ask about the abolitionists and maybe historians today, if we were going to name names, maybe not, who are still debating the compromise constitution. The abolitionists were debating it back then. What is it? Is it slavery or anti-slavery document? And that's discussed at length here in the book. And there are many people that Noah brings in here that you need to meet if you don't know them. Some you do. Henry Clay, Douglas, Frederick Douglass, Anna Cara, Vallandigham, but also Robert Purvis, Charles Lennox Raymond, I should say, and William Howard Day. There are people you're going to meet in here that have something to tell about this story. And the other thing that I didn't get to, which I also the cotton gin is in here. So there are numbers of things. I was going to ask something on Jackson. Here it is. That was also, you're talking about Jackson's rejection of John C. Calhoun's nullification theory and policy, and why that was important to Lincoln. Well, our time is almost up, and I think Bjorn has some things, but I think that's something that you can get in this book that you don't get anywhere else. Get the book, read it, enjoy. Bjorn.
Exactly. And it is a wonderful book. Noah, I am going to read through, as often happens in these conversations, people start getting really great ideas for questions when there's 5 minutes left. And so I'm going to read through some of the questions and acknowledge some of the people that asked them in the way that Daniel just did, showing that these are great questions and the answers are in the book largely. But I might have one that I want you to shout out on. Lynn Bristol, thank you for this one. Lynn wanted to know, is it correct that Jefferson Davis suspended the writ of habeas corpus throughout the Confederacy? The book does, in some ways, address Jefferson Davis, although it's really about Lincoln and the U.S. Constitution. Bob Willard in California brings up the fact that the Articles of Confederation declared the Union perpetual, although we weren't living under the Articles of Confederation during the part of what Noah is writing about. But Dave Bradley in the UK gives us a good question that Noah might be able to wrap this up on. And I love this because this is the eternal conflict between the Constitution and the executive's duty. Did Lincoln not have a duty to put down an armed insurrection against the federal government, notwithstanding what the Constitution supposedly said?
Parenthetically, yes, Jeff Davis did suspend habeas corpus in the Confederacy late in the war and was harshly criticized for it, including by his own vice president. I think David Bradley's question is appropriately astute and unsurprisingly so. I do think that we have to project backwards to the 19th century how a president would think of the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. Because if you think of it, when Aaron Burr had his conspiracy to remove a whole bunch of territories from the Union and possibly be joined by some states as well, Thomas Jefferson was president, and he wasn't happy about it, but his view was that if that happened, there would be nothing that he would really do about it. There was no serious talk of raising an army to coerce the residents of those territories back in. And that was because Jefferson, as a Lockean, believed in the consent of the governed. And so he also had this theory of revolution, that he had made a revolution. Similarly, Lincoln, when he was in Congress, gave a speech, which I quote in the book, where he's talking about the Mexican War, and he's talking about the Texans who made a revolution against Mexico. And he says, if any group of people revolutionizes and they can successfully revolutionize, and a majority of them share that view, they're entitled to make a revolution. So Lincoln could have had the view that under the circumstances of the United States at the time, it was permissible for people who made a revolution to walk away, and that it was not within his military capacity or his desire to coerce them to remain in. He didn't, and in that sense, he introduced our contemporary conception of the United States as a fixed nation state, really, that can't tolerate something like an act of secession. You know, as a country where the reason of state, the raison d'etat, is so strong that no president could tolerate such a thing happening. So that's the case today, and that's why in retrospect it looks so inevitable. But that was not the only way to think about the Union, even as late as the 1860s, as James Buchanan's view demonstrates, and the view of a good number of other Northerners demonstrates. So Lincoln did what he thought he had to do, and in that sense, he was acting according to the impulse of a leader who feels a duty to hold the country together no matter what. But he didn't have to feel that way, and that's also part of his greatness, that he had that view and he imposed that view, and then that view became the standard view to which we all adhere today, our own view of our own country.
Excellent answer. Thank you, Noah. Daniel, do you have anything to add before we bow out?
I think Noah has things to do, we've been told, so we'll let him go. We're so appreciative, Noah, that you joined us. I think this is an important subject and an important book, and should be on an essential Lincoln bookshelf, which we, by the way, have if you go to our website. So thank you again for that. And I'll just go back to the Blackhawk War. Many of our viewers who've been here with us for a long time know that I bring this up, that I once owned the note where Lincoln signed his first elective signature when he was elected by his friends and neighbors, which you alluded to. And of course, what he said, when you quote, of all the successes I've had, as the one that given me the most pleasure. And I agree with Mr. Lincoln and go back to that moment as well as maybe one of the most important moments in his life, not only politically, but also legally. John Stuart got him to get into the law because they met there as well. Thank you again, Noah.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Bjorn. It means a lot to have a book carefully read by the people who care most about the subject. And so I'm especially grateful for this detailed conversation and for your time and attention to the book, and also for all that you do through the Lincoln Bookshop for the memory of Lincoln and American history more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for our audience there, again, the book is The Broken Constitution, Lincoln, Slavery, and the Refounding of America by Noah Feldman. It is available. If you click through the link to our website, you can order it up and we will send it to you. Thank you again for joining us on A House Divided, live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago.